Welcome everybody to this study that we're doing on relationships. This by Dr. Robert Russell, and I am not Dr. Robert Russell. He came up to me Sunday and asked me would I teach for him tonight. He had to be somewhere with his family, and so I told him that I would. And so glad you showed up anyway, because you didn't really know, right, that I was teaching. So just kidding. All right. So anyway, I'm glad you're here. He sent me his notes. I am not teaching from his outline. I'm using some of the things he had. I am using his topic, and I'm folding some things in that I'd done in the past as well. And so the topic, does everybody have a handout? If you don't, there's some laying around on the seats back there. You should be able to find them laying around, or there's some right up here on the seats in the front. So what we're going to do is, if this is your first time here on Wednesday, then we do this short teaching, and then you guys all circle up in groups and talk about the questions that we have here, right? Carrying that through, and that's what we've been doing. If you have not been in a group, don't freak out. There are plenty of groups that's willing to take you into a group, and you don't even have to talk if you don't want to, but usually when people get to talking, then everybody tends to want to chime in. But this has been a really good thing that we've been doing with getting people into these community groups, trying to build unity through community. So part two of this relationship study tonight, we're talking about, this is actually Robert's title, The Core of Relationships, and we're going to talk about trust. Now, does anybody here know anybody, I'll come in the back door, that has had trust issues? I'm sure that we all know people who had trust issues, and if I ask you how many of us actually have trust issues, then maybe we've all had trust issues at one time or another in our life, and that's a pretty common thing that a lot of people have, is we have these trust issues. So, dealing with relationships, and no matter what kind of relationship we're in, if we're in a marriage, if we're in a dating relationship, if we're just single and just relationship with coworkers or whatever, almost every relationship that you're involved in, we bump up against this whole thing, trust, right? And how many times have you come up against somebody and because of something that's gone wrong in the past or whatever, they're like, I'm never trusting anybody again. I'll never trust anybody. Maybe we even said that ourselves, but trust is a universal thing that we all deal with. And so trust, and that's why I think Robert called this the core of relationships. And so where we start here is loving involves trusting. And so in any kind of relationship that we're in, as far as whether we're in single, getting ready to go in a dating relationship, marriage relationship, or whatever your situation is, we need to understand that loving involves trusting. And so where I want to go here is in this passage, it's the love chapter. And if you've ever been to a wedding, this is a famous passage, but let's just start there because we need to see how these two things are connected, love and trust. And so you're probably familiar, but let's read through it here. Love is patient. Love is kind. Now notice, this is talking about what love is, and then we're going to transition in a second. But it says, love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it doesn't boast, it is not proud, it is not rude, and it is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered, and it keeps no record of wrongs. And I thought that was interesting. I highlighted that there because in a certain sort of way, this little phrase right here still kind of ties into trust. Because how many of us, if you think about that, when you think about the love chapter and we talk about that love section there and we talk about love is patient, kind, how many of us really stick on this phrase right here, that love keeps no record of wrongs? Probably very few of us. But if you think about that, like if we don't trust somebody or whatever, and as soon as we bump up against something, whether they've lied to us or whatever, what do? We pull out our list, right? Because they've done this, and here you've done it again, and so now I'm pulling out my list, and here it is. And so this whole thing is very important to remember because love, if it's true, and we believe it is as followers of Jesus, love keeps no record of wrongs. And see, the thing about this too, and this is a whole teaching in itself, and I'm going to move on, but we do that to ourselves. We keep a record of wrongs on ourselves, don't we? Every time we mess up, we say a lot, I can't forgive myself. Why? Because I have this big long list. But see, love, if we're true to the definition of love, love keeps no record of wrongs. Then it always protects. And so see, this is where the writer Paul shifts gears because he's talking about everything that love is, And now he begins to say these other things. It always. So this is something that is a constant with love. It always protects. Here's our word. It always trusts. And from the New American Standard, it said it believes all things. Trust means believes all things. So it always protects. It always trusts. There's a word. Always hopes. Always perseveres. Love never fails. So there it is, right there in the love chapter. So loving involves trusting. And so then to go a step further, what Jesus said in John chapter 13, remember he said, this new command that I give to you, love one another as I have loved you. So there's the whole thing, love and trust tied together. And this is something Jesus said, going back to the core, as followers of Jesus, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. And here's why, because by this, all men will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. So see, as followers of Jesus, I mean, we're identified by the way we love, and you could almost say by how you trust. Because if loving is trusting, then by this is how people are going to recognize that we are a different person. So see, this whole message that we're talking about here tonight, this is basically talking to us who are followers of Jesus, that have built our life as followers of him and what his teachings are. And so our whole relationships are centered around what he teaches. And so everything we're talking about here is truth that we have to look at. So by this, all men will know that you are my disciples. And so then you would think, okay, but how many times do I have to trust somebody? I mean, there has to be balance in trust, you would think. There has to be balance in it, because you can't just, universally. And this is a hard topic. I mean, maybe you have some feedback that you could raise your hand and throw in here. But I mean, if we're supposed to trust, always trust, as it said there in, Paul said in Corinthians, then where is the balance in that? I got to thinking about that, because you can't just say, okay, yeah, you did this. Yeah, sure, do it again. And I know Jesus said the whole thing that you got to forgive 70 times 7 and all that, but is there any balance in that anywhere in trusting each other or being trusted or whatever? There has to be some balance. And so then here's an interesting thing. In John chapter 2, and this is Jesus, they're talking about Jesus, and it said, now while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many people saw the miraculous signs he was doing and believed in his name. So these are people that were following Jesus. And then look what it says about Jesus. But Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all men, and he did not need man's testimony about man, for he knew what was in a man. So see, that seems like it's in conflict that, Paul said, because he learned all his stuff from, the teachings of Jesus, the apostles, and all these things and the other. And then Jesus is saying here that he would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all men. And he didn't need the testimony about them because he knew what was in a man. But see, somewhere in there, I think there's that fine line going on that we got to realize that we live in this physical body that we call the flesh. And then we have this spiritual body, and so we have to keep our eyes focused like Jesus did. See, he could see something else going on because it said he knew what was in a man. And so somewhere there has to be that connection spiritually where we're staying connected to God, that even though we're supposed to trust, that we still would look at that person like, I can trust what that person may be saying in the spirit, but I can't trust what's going on in their flesh. And there's that fine line in there, and how do I know where that is? And I don't have an answer for it, and there's not a formula for it. But, as followers of Christ, we do have the Holy Spirit living within us, but we can look at people as spiritual beings for discernment and not be putting our trust in just their actions and everything that's going on, and trying to focus ourselves on what God may be seeing through them. Does that make any sense? I mean, it gets real complicated to me, but because there is that fine line where you want to trust, you just don't want to write people off, but then you're like, okay, but we know, just looking at somebody, you're like, I know I can't believe what you're saying, I can't trust you, and all this. It gets all jumbled. And so, anyway, that's what Jesus was saying there. He didn't trust himself to them, for he knew all men, and he knew what was in a man. So then why is it so hard to trust? And if we're having these trust issues, I mean, again, in whatever your situation is, my situation, I mean, I've had trust issues my whole life, and now I'm 14 years, let me get this right, into my new marriage. And I mean, I really haven't had any trust issues, but first starting out in the marriage, I mean, there were trust issues. But why is it so hard to trust? And so there's past wounds. And there are things that have happened in our past whether we want to acknowledge or not, that we probably are carrying into our future. So, I mean, there's a lot of those reasons that it makes it very hard to trust because there may be past wounds. We may say we've been burnt too many times. And so, they've done this, they've done that, and done that. So there's no way that I'm going to trust them again. It's unrealistic expectations. Maybe I'm expecting too much out of them. Maybe I'm somebody that just drives people too hard as far as my children, and then they've reached this point that they've never been able to satisfy or whatever, and then it's just like I can't, maybe the expectations were just unrealistic. But we have to look at all those things when it comes to trust. We have to really be drilling down to try to figure out what's going on there, because the results can be this. We can fearfully trust no one and live in isolation. I mean, do you know people like that? I mean, there could be even people like that in this room. I mean, I used to be that person. I mean, we can fearfully trust no one because of all these past wounds that we've had going on from childhood, past relationships, or all these different things going on. And we can fearfully trust no one and just live in isolation and say, I'm never going to get involved again. I'm never going to go anywhere. Even if I come to a place like this and say I've got to get some kind of help, then really I'm just going to sit here. I'm not really going to connect. I'm going to wear that mask. I did a teaching sometime back where I talked about wearing a mask. And, we let people perceive who we want them to think we are, and really what they're doing is they're loving a false person because we're not letting them penetrate who we really are. So see, if we've been really wounded, then we may be trusting no one and living in total isolation. And that doesn't mean, that we're just staying home and not going anywhere. We may be here and we're in a bubble. Like, you can get this close, but you're not going to get this close. And I'm not talking about necessarily physically. I'm talking about I will say this much to you, but I will never say this much to you. I'll let you know this much about me, but I'll never let you know that much about me. Or the person you're talking to. How many people do you know and you're like, I've known that person for how many years? And if you really stop and thought about it for a few minutes, maybe there's those people in our life, it's like, I really don't even know them at all. I mean, I know this, I know that, I know what they do. I know what they say. I know that they say they have X amount of children. I know that they do this, and I interact with them all the time. But really, do I really know them? How many times have you bumped into somebody and you've known them for a long time, and all of a sudden that you found out, oh, I had no idea that they were addicted to that. I had no idea that they were getting ready to go through a divorce. I had no idea that they had that going on in their life to where they were struggling with these family members and all this other stuff was going on because they didn't trust anybody enough to share what was going on in their life, which could have led to part of the problem that's going on because we're designed to be in community, which is what we've really been pushing around here. So we can fearfully trust no one and live in isolation, or we can naively trust everyone and live as a victim. Now, we see that all the time. I mean, that's why a lot of us have been married 3 or 4 times or have been in 10 or 15 relationships or 16 or 20 or ever how many you've been in, because we have naively trusted everyone, and then anytime something happened, then we become the victim, right? I can't believe this happened to me, because we had no wisdom at all, and we just naively trusted whoever, whatever group. It could have been a single person. It could have been a group of people. How many churches have fallen apart? I just trusted him so much, and then bam, it fell apart. I mean, we trust everybody, and then we end up living as a victim because we're not willing to come out of it. And so there's 2 parts to that we have to think about as well. So I would ask you this as we move forward here. Are you earning trust? Because, see, there's 2 sides to this, and you could be on both. Are you trying to earn trust from somebody, or are you trying to learn to trust somebody? See, if we're trying to earn trust from somebody, then we probably have wounded that relationship somehow. We're trying to earn that trust back, right? But see, if we're learning to trust, then we've probably been wounded. And then we're like, okay, I'm going to let you this close, but I'm not going to let you that close. And see, we could be very well both ways. We could still be trying to learn to trust, and there could still people that's trying to earn our trust. And that's a whole big ball of stuff that we have to untangle, because trust in relationships is so important. So are you earning trust, trying to earn trust, or are you learning to trust? So how do we earn trust? Let's talk about that one just for a second here. How do we earn trust if we have broke that relationship with somebody and we're trying to earn trust back? Well, you have to start with God. And so, how do we start with God? And here's where I think we get this upside down. I want you to think about this. This is what I think we do. We practice our trust with people. In other words, we try to build a new relationship and we're like, this one sounds right, and so I'm going to build this relationship with this person, and I'm really going to practice trust. And so we practice our trust with people, but then we project that experience onto God. Now think about that, because I hear this all the time when I counsel, and you probably bumped up against people too. It's like, I just can't trust anybody, I can't even trust God. And so the reason that we say stuff like that, and you know it's true, is because we get most of our practice of trust with people. And then we project that trust experience onto God, which is not fair with God because, he's not a human. I mean, he was in the form of Jesus, but if you go back and just study the life of Jesus, there was nothing in his life that was indicate that we couldn't trust him. So see, God gets a bad rap on the trust end because we practice a lot of our trust with people, and then we project that experience onto God, which should be our main source of trust. And so what we should be doing, and I didn't put this part in your notes, is flip it. We should be practicing our trust with God, putting him first, and then projecting our experience onto people. Now, can you imagine what that would look like? I mean, if our total focus was like, okay, God, everybody in my whole world has rocked my world. They have let me down. They've tossed me out. I've burnt too many bridges. I can't trust anybody. I'm going to stay in this hole. But if we just decided, I'm just going to start trusting God, and then we take what we learn from God because we keep forgetting we're followers of Jesus. We have that whole Holy Spirit living inside of us. And then we project what God's teaching and project that experience onto people. That whole dynamic would change. But see, whenever we take our experiences with people and practice that on God, it creates a sense of separation that I can't trust God, which is not true at all. So we have to put our trust first in God. So we start with God is how we begin to earn trust. And then we seek wisdom. We need to seek wisdom in everything we do when we're trying to build trust. And so how do we do that? Loving and trusting, those two are tied together. We already set that foundation. Loving and trusting properly requires balanced wisdom. I mean, it has to have wisdom. I mean, how many times have we tried something our own way and it didn't work? I mean, that way I tried that, it didn't work. I went into this relationship, that didn't work. I thought I had this right, that didn't work. I asked all my buddies, they thought I was right, that didn't work, that failed. So then we come back and we're like, okay, all I can do is pray, right? And so we hear it all the time, but if we would back up and realize that loving and trusting properly requires balanced wisdom, and we start again with God and looking for that balanced wisdom. And I think y'all talked about this. It was in your notes last week. This was the whole foundation in Proverbs. I mean, this could be the theme for this whole study all the way through this relationship, but especially here, there's the word again. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him and he will make your path straight. So see, that's again putting our experience of trust first in God. Okay, God, what do I do here? This looks like a God thing. How many times have we said that? This looks like a God thing, so I'm going this way. But then it ended up being deception, which we've learned that many things that look like God things are deception. But if we're looking for that balance in godly wisdom, then we're looking to put our trust in God first with all our heart and everything, and not leaning on our own understanding, but acknowledging him in all our ways, and he'll make our path straight. So we're starting with God, we're seeking wisdom, and then this is just this is a universal rule, time and experience. I mean, if we're trying to earn trust from somebody, it's going to take time and experience. I mean, how many times have you been in this situation where it's like somebody messed up or you messed up, and it's like, okay, God forgives me, do you forgive me? Now tomorrow, the next day, it's like, okay, I'm going to do this or I'm doing that. Wait a minute, why don't you trust me? Everybody else, and we want that immediate trust to be restored, don't we? And the person that offended or went astray or whatever, they want that trust to be restored immediately. But see, it just takes time and experience. And so hopefully the other person is working through that whole thing as well and putting God first, but it takes time and experience and transparency. If we're trying to earn trust, if you're on that side of the coin, transparency is huge. I mean, I could tell you so many stories about transparency and how, you just have to be so transparent, like picking up the phone. I'm 10 minutes late. Hey, I'm right here. I'm with such and such. You can talk to them. I'm here. Or if it's, people have had issues with having affairs or kids have run astray and you can't have the car anymore. I mean, I know one guy, one story, a guy shared his testimony. He had this problem with alcohol and pornography, and literally to rebuild his trust with his wife, um, he just literally called her a dictator, basically. But he submitted in a good way. It was a beautiful picture because for a while, I mean, she took his car keys, she drove him to work, she took all his credit cards, she'd give him $10 a day, she made him account for if you got a thing out of the Coke machine, a drink machine, or whatever, he had to account for it. And as they rebuilt that trust over, and he was fully willing to do it because he loved his family and he was so sincere. And it sounded like he was a whip pup, but in his humility he was, but he also in his humility was willing to do whatever he had to do to rebuild that trust. And he told this one story that, one Saturday they got out, everything had been going good for a while, and he's getting ready to mow the yard, and he's out of gas, and he says, honey, I need the car keys, I need to get some gas and to mow the yard. And she said, get your can. And so she got his gas can, took him to get gas, came back and mowed the yard. But 3 or 4 months as they got into that trust began to be restored through time and experience. And eventually, he got his car keys back, he got all the credit cards back, he got all those things back. They've been restored in their marriage for probably, I don't know, it's been a good 10 years now. But it was through transparency and time and experience was how he was rebuilding and earning that trust with her. And so don't be defensive. If you're on that end where you're trying to earn trust again, and somebody says, I don't realize where you were. There's a gap here where there's an hour I can't account for, if it's time or money or whatever it is you're talking about. Don't be defensive. Realize that we're the one trying to earn the trust. And so as followers of Jesus, we want to be in that position where it's like, yes, you're right. I fully understand your side of it because you think because of past wounds that I may have taken that hour or taken this $100 or taken that whatever and done this. So you're exactly right. I need to show you exactly what's going on with that. So don't be defensive if we're on that end trying to earn trust. And now what if we're trying to learn to trust? If we're on that other end and we're like, you've burnt these bridges so many times, so what am I going to do? I don't know how to get past this. How am I going to learn to trust you again? Again, you got to start with God. We got to put him first. We got to seek wisdom. We got to look for the root source. You have to deal with that root source. If you have trust issues, you got to realize that, there's that thing going on inside of us too, that if we're not trusting somebody, that it's doing something physically to us as well. And so we want God to work us through that. And so we got to look for that root source. We got to be willing to deal with that. I'll tell you a story, a quick story. If I've said this, it bears repeating if you've heard the story, but I was dealing with this guy in jail. We were in a class, and we were going through some studies to see how their addictions got to where they were. And he'd been married. He was on his 3rd marriage. And so in the course of that study, he said, Roger, he said, I really love my first wife more than the wife I'm with now. He said, I really blew it in that marriage. And I said, really? And he said, yeah, and she's remarried, and I'm remarried. There's nothing to do about it. But he said, just reading through all this stuff, he said, I realized that whole thing was my fault, how it self. And it just came to him what had happened. I said, so tell me what happened. And so what happened was, as he grew up as a child, his father, he was with his mother was having an affair almost constantly. He was the baby. And so she would take him everywhere she went to have the affair. And in a lot of cases, she would make him stay in the car while she went out and went over a hill or into the woods or whatever, and he was in the car and he knew what was going on and all these things. And so his dad never knew anything about it because he was her alibi. He was the baby. Me and the baby are going somewhere. He's 5, 6, whatever. So anyway, that went on and on and on for basically until he moved out, and then the family ended up getting divorced or whatever, and he never said anything about it. So when he got married, that came back to haunt him, and he didn't realize it because guess what happened every time his wife went to the grocery store? Every time his wife went to Walmart, every time his wife said, I'm going shopping, every time his wife said, I'm going on a girls' night out, and we'll be back by 10. Guess what's going on in his mind? She leaves, she's going somewhere, she's having an affair, I'm left here with the kids, He was obsessing. He was calling, where are you at? Why aren't you home? What's wrong with you? How dare you stay gone that long? You said you was going to be home at 7 o'clock. It's 7:15. Where have you been? And so his whole first marriage, he bombarded her with all that stuff, which literally was basically a whole trust issue that was a past wound that was taking shape in a present situation. So see, many times, and this is one of the main things that we have got to take away from this, is like if we have trust issues, I mean, if they're not right in front of you, I mean, we have to ask ourselves, like, if something happens in my marriage, early in my marriage, something would happen with Clarissa. And I would think, why are you doing that? Why did you do that? And so then I would realize, wait a minute. This is something that happened in the past that she's doing something now that happened to me in my past, and it makes me feel that same way, but it is not true about her. So I had to be able to separate. This is my trust issue. She is not that person that violated that trust in the past. You get what I'm saying? So, I mean, you and I have got to dig in. And if we see those things, if we have trust issues, that's the first thing we have to ask ourselves. What is that root source? And it may be that, well, the person I'm with right now, I have every reason. They've done 15, 25, 34 things that obviously has violated my trust, and they may all be right there. But if there is no reason, then we have to stop and say, why am I getting triggered by everything this person does? And I know this person is pure and I love them, and there's no reason at all there that I cannot trust this person. And so, and then if we have problem trusting other people, we have to look at that, well, why? What is that thing that happened in their past? So we got to look at those things. You may almost always have to go look at something in the past. I mean, there are other present things, but we do have to look for that root source. And then communication is the main thing. And it's the same thing as transparency. If you're trying, how do we learn to trust somebody? We have to communicate. And when I say communicate, and I've learned this from lots of stuff, I mean, we have to be able to communicate that, did you really mean that way? It makes me feel like I don't trust you, or you're not trusting me, or when you say this and that. And I mean, is this valid? Because feelings lie. And so communication, transparency, all those things are something we have to do. And then time and experience again. I mean, some of these things you just can't. I mean, God can miraculously do all these things, but still we're going to have those triggers in our head, and time and experience will fade those things away. But that's how we begin to learn trust. And so here we go. We're back to the same thing. Trust in the Lord. That's the first spot. And do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. And so here's our discussion questions, and I think all these are on your paper. And you may even have some more that you've jotted down as we've been talking about this. But are you learning to trust, or are you trying to earn trust? So you need to know which side you're coming from, and it may be both. I mean, I'm trying to build trust with somebody, but then I'm trying to get somebody to trust me as well. So which side are you really coming from? Because somebody's got somebody in their life, or you are that person that we're dealing with. And then who or what do you trust? Because we trust something. I mean, even if it's our car, I don't trust anybody else, but I trust my car or whatever. I trust in me as a person, I mean, we trust something. So who or what do you trust? In what areas of life are you hesitant to trust God? And see, that's another one. Like if you have an area that you're hesitant to trust God, then there is probably somewhere in your recent past or back way in your past somewhere that something has triggered, that there's a reason that we're hesitant to trust God in some certain area. And so then how are love and trust interrelated? We talked about that, so that's a good one to talk about that, because how do you love? How do you trust? How do you love? How do you trust? And then what damages trust in relationships? Man, that's a wide open one, isn't it? And then how does fear affect trust in relationships? And fear, I think Robert has talked about that a lot, and he'll be talking about it more in the coming weeks. So there's the questions. Trust is the core of relationships, part 2. Now, I would just imagine, as you guys circle up, you're not going to have any problem talking about trust issues, right? Because everybody's got a story. So let me pray for us. God, thank you so much for loving us. I thank you for this time. Thank you for every person here. We thank you that you've designed us to be in relationships. And Lord, these trust things, they are a direct dart from the enemy to try to destroy what you want to have as relationships. So Lord, help us with these things. Help us with these discussions. Give us transparency. Help us talk about those things you want us to hear and the things you want us to say. We love you so much. In the name of Jesus, amen. I also put a plug in. two plugs, actually, since I have the mic tonight. If you're a man, this study we're going to be doing starting in April, 7 questions that rattle in the mind of most men. It'll be really good dealing with this kind of stuff here. And then if you have real trust issues with families, Boundaries starts on Sunday night in April, so that's another good one. I know Phyllis could tell you some other good ones as well. So thank you for listening, and if you need handouts, they're here, they're scattered around, and circle up in your groups, get started. Thank you for that.